Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. Hello and welcome to this webinar from the Vision for Volunteering on Insights and Inspiration. If you don't know who I am, my name is Sarah Tranter. My pronouns are she and they. I am the Learning and Storytelling Officer with the Vision for Volunteering. I've been around with the Vision since last April, and we have over the last 18 months been talking to people kind of all across the country about the Vision for Volunteering, hearing from you guys about your experiences, your kind of experiments, your actions, talking to people about what the themes mean for them, and how it's really kind of looking on the ground. So what this webinar is going to be is a kind of synthesis of all of that learning that we've been hearing over the last year and a bit. It's going to kind of go through by each of the themes, looking at what we've learned, what we've heard, some kind of challenges back to you guys of questions that you might want to consider in your journeys with the Vision for Volunteering. And then we've also got some, hopefully some kind of inspiring stories about people who are doing interesting things under the Vision for Volunteering to kind of get you thinking about what it is that you guys could do next. So hopefully everybody here is already aware of what the Vision for Volunteering is. That's why you're here. If you aren't, we do have lots of resources on our website which give you a kind of good overview of the Vision for Volunteering. In a nutshell, it is a 10-year program from here to 2032, looking at how we really improve the experiences of volunteers and achieve kind of really high quality volunteering for everybody across the sector. And that is volunteering in any form, whether it's kind of really formal volunteering through to informal volunteering, micro volunteering, one-off kind of campaigning or fundraising, or simply just kind of being a good neighbor. So we have 5 themes for the Vision for Volunteering. Those are up on the screen now. So you've got awareness and appreciation, power, equity and inclusion, collaboration, and experimentation. And all of these insights that I'm going to share today, I'm going to be going through by theme. So we'll start with the first theme, which is awareness and appreciation. So this theme is really all about how do we relate to our volunteers? How do we make them feel welcome, feel valued? But it's also about how we kind of build our programs around our volunteers. How do we make it really easy for people to volunteer? How do we make sure that people volunteer at kind of every stage of their life, no matter where they are, who they are, or where they're coming from? So some of the things that we've heard, firstly, terminology really matters. So not everybody uses the word volunteer to describe their work. We've got a quote from a lady called Charlotte here, who's a trustee and a volunteer manager now, who says, "I never once thought of myself as a volunteer or the people that we were working alongside as volunteers. It was just something that we were all really passionate about. And the only way that we could make the games and the events happen," I think these were hockey games, but I never really thought of myself as a volunteer. And that's something that we really want to kind of run through the heart of our work with the Vision for Volunteering, is that this is for everybody, no matter who you are, where you're from. And then my kind of challenge back to you is, so how do we make stuff that's not formal volunteering, something that somebody wouldn't even use the word volunteer to talk about themselves, how do we make that feel just as appreciated and valued as formal volunteering? And there are lots of ways that people kind of show appreciation for their volunteers, from the kind of like the thank you cards and the certificates and all of that sort of stuff. But a slightly different approach might need to be taken for a slightly more informal group of volunteers. So I challenge you to kind of think a little bit about that. Another part of awareness and appreciation is about understanding the impact. So in order for volunteers to actually feel appreciated, they need to really kind of understand the impact that they are having. But also everybody around them needs to understand the impact that they are having, whether that is the volunteer managers or the service users or the wider community or policymakers or other kind of decision makers within and sort of internal and external to the organization. It's something that we have heard can be really, really difficult to capture. A lot of work with volunteers is something that's not easily kind of quantifiable. It can be something that's really kind of qualitative, which is a word I always stumble over. but also can be kind of difficult to kind of show the impact that that's having. And there's a quote here from a volunteer called Laura, who said that it was the most important thing for her when she was volunteering was seeing the difference that she'd made, even if it was those really small things, just a small interaction, something that's really small and easy and practical for me to do to make a difference. And those are the things that are really important to capture, to kind of give people that motivation and give people that kind of desire to keep coming back, that can be difficult to present in kind of numbers and formal reports. So my challenge back to you is, how do we present this information to volunteers and others in a way that makes them understand the impact that they're having, make them and others understand the impact that they're having? And we might need to take a more creative approach to this, making use of role models, for example. And we also have some resources on the Vision for Volunteering website about how to create a kind of visual map of impacts. That might be another way of looking at how you present this information, but that's going to look different for everybody. So figure out what works for you, and run with that. Next one is passion is key. I mean, this is something that you probably all know, and something that we've been hearing repeatedly, is that just a key motivator for volunteers is that passion that connects them to their work. We've got Richard here, volunteer and parish councillor, who says it's a two-way thing. It's not purely altruistic. He does things because he enjoys doing them. What I found is you must do things that you've got your heart into. I do it because I want to do it. And that is something that's really important to understand, but also just really important to connect to with your volunteers. You know, it's not just about what they can do for you, it's about what they can get back from it, both in terms of practical considerations like skills and experience, but also just the passions and the enjoyment that they can get from that. So how can we use this two-way benefit, kind of really consciously use this two-way benefit to support and attract and retain volunteers into the kind of volunteering work that we do? And then another thing that we've heard a lot is the funding. You know, we live in difficult times. Lots of people are under increasing pressure, and funding challenges are particularly difficult. This is something that can be a real demotivator for anybody, but also for volunteers, particularly something around this kind of short-term funding, which can create kind of anxiety in volunteers about whether or not there'll be any kind of like long-term impact of the work that they're doing. It can kind of undermine those other positive efforts that you make to make volunteers feel appreciated and valued. And I think this one is really particularly pertinent for projects that are really volunteer-led, where there maybe are no kind of paid members of staff, because it can be, you know, it can be a kind of question of legacy. So Richard again says probably the biggest challenge is finding funds and raising money to deliver these projects. So the thing that I'd really like you to think about is just, how do we protect volunteers from this fundraising anxiety? Easier said than done, especially when perhaps as a paid member of staff you're struggling with fundraising anxiety as well. But and this is another conversation that we really want to have with funders, about how we kind of bring more sustainability into what we do with volunteers, but also that funders take really seriously the kind of role that volunteers play in delivering and kind of running services. If you were around earlier this year, you'll know that we ran a series of conferences on each of the themes of the Vision for Volunteering. That was from January to March this year. If you weren't able to catch those conferences, all of the recordings are available on our website. They're a good couple of hours long each, so if you've got, you know, a little bit of time to kill and a cup of tea, please do go onto our website and watch those. One of the things that we did at those conferences was ask people a couple of questions. So we asked people about how you would rate your own organization for awareness and appreciation, and then how would your volunteers rate you? So you can see some of that data in front of you here. Awareness and appreciation is one that's pretty balanced, actually. People think that their impression of the organization, their volunteers' impression of the organization, is around about the same place, which is around the sort of 3 to a 4. which is really good. And I'd really encourage you to think about these questions within your own organization. And if you don't know what your volunteers think about how you're doing something like awareness appreciation, then the best solution is to go and ask them, obviously. We also asked people to tell us kind of what they thought that was going well around this theme. The word volunteers pops up a lot there, but what people think are doing well are things like newsletters, awards, regular communications, sort of to and from volunteers, making sure to take the time to thank people, a general kind of like friendliness towards volunteers and with those volunteers, things like supervision, and a focus on volunteer well-being. So taking a kind of real interest in how the volunteers are doing, how the work that they're doing is affecting them, and what more that they might want out of that. And then on the flip side, what needs improvement? And here people talked about things like your processes, and making this a kind of consistent thing across, well, within the same organization, but also across organizations. Making sure that managers are buying in, that those kind of senior decision makers within organizations really understand the value of volunteers as well. People talked about short-term volunteering and about how that kind of necessitates maybe a little bit more effort to make people feel appreciated. Organization-wide thanking, and then other things like rewards and skills, and again, kind of looking at that like two-way relationship with those volunteers. So then in summary, what are the things that we want to focus on going forward? I've picked out 3 things for each theme. For this one, it's about influencing up. So lots of volunteer managers and volunteers themselves really do see the value of volunteers, and about this kind of flexible working with volunteers and this two-way relationship, but there is more work to do. I've just seen in the chat people are asking about the slides being available. Yes, the recording of this entire webinar will be available online, and I will share the slides afterwards, so you don't need to make loads of notes. But yes, there's more work to do among senior leaders, funders, policymakers. Data is your friend, although it can be, you know, qualitative and quantitative data are both really key for kind of making that case for the impact that the volunteers and volunteering is having within your service or within your community. Storytelling. It's really important to allow volunteers to tell their stories in their own words. I mean, this is a really powerful way of communicating exactly what it means to people and kind of really understanding that impact, as well as kind of providing inspiration for others. And it gives you your own insight actually into what your volunteers need and want and kind of what their motivations are. And we do have some resources around storytelling on our website. If you're interested in learning more, we do also occasionally run training sessions around those. And then finally, I've said it before, I'll say it again until I go blue in the face, listen to your volunteers, build up that two-way communication with them. The best way to know how your volunteers want to be appreciated, want the service to be run, want their volunteering to be run is to ask them, talk to them, get to know them. And the better that relationship is, the better the service will be for everybody. So moving on to power. And power is one of those themes that lots of people really kind of, lots of people struggle with. It can feel like quite a kind of scary concept, giving power to volunteers. And we also have to be careful to tread a line that we're not giving power to volunteers in ways that are inappropriate or in ways that are greater than what those volunteers want to be given. So there's a lot of challenges around this. What we've kind of learned over the last year and a bit is that giving volunteers more power is a good thing. It's good for everybody. It's really good for getting volunteers really invested in what they're doing. And the more kind of power that you give to your volunteers to shape those volunteering opportunities, probably the better service that you're going to have. And it really aids with recruitment, making your kind of organization more attractive to recruit for if you have a more kind of grown-up relationship with your volunteers. David from the Emmaus North staff said volunteering is about giving people opportunities to feel included, to feel they can learn something, to feel they can develop new skills and develop themselves as an individual. And then his challenge to you is that it's up to us, up to you as an organization, as a volunteer manager, as somebody who works with volunteers, to have a system to do this. So I'd really challenge you to think about how you can give your volunteers more opportunities to feel included, to feel listened to, and to feel empowered with what you do. And that can be a kind of scary step into the unknown, and that is okay. And we will talk a little bit more about that when we get to the theme of experimentation. So often volunteers do have power, and it can be, they can need some help to kind of fully realize this. Volunteers, particularly in more kind of like traditional volunteering setups, don't necessarily understand the power and value that they have. Michael says it's very important to me thinking about the opportunities that people do or don't have for giving their time and their care. People's choices are massively constrained by how much power that they have. And as we said on the last slide, it is up to you to try and distribute that power in a way that is fair and equal and useful. So how can you kind of help your volunteers step into that power? And that could be something like giving them the skills and the tools and the knowledge that they need to be able to kind of take full advantage of those opportunities that you might be giving them. Then there is also a question of leadership. Someone in the chat I see has just mentioned co-production. Yeah, co-production is a really great way of giving volunteers more power. And what we found is that it's actually often easier for volunteers to give powers to volunteers through their voices through something like co-production than it is to recognize volunteers as leaders. And that's really where we're trying to get to, is where stuff is volunteer-led. And that sort of stuff is really kind of developed as part of the program. So the challenge is that, do you know the difference between power through voice and power through leadership? And how do you give volunteers more real decision-making power within the organization? And we see that through trustees, for example. They're a really brilliant example of volunteers who also have a lot of decision-making power. And they sit in quite a kind of unique position within the voluntary world. But other volunteers who aren't necessarily trustees may also be interested in getting involved in that kind of decision-making or strategic thinking. And how do we involve them as much as they like in those sorts of spaces, in those conversations. And then finally, around lived experience, I'm going to be coming back to this concept of storytelling quite often. So involving those voices, those ideas of volunteers is really important for making sure that you're tailoring initiatives that really resonate with those involved. Eunice says volunteering is a two-way process. Every party needs to benefit from the experience. So it's about understanding their why. It's about creating a conducive environment where they can express themselves. So how is your service delivery built around your volunteers? And have you built in consideration of lived experience into that? And that overlaps quite a lot with ideas of equality and diversity, which is the next theme that we will come to in a second. So some stats again. How would you rate your organization for power? How would your volunteers rate you? This one is a little bit interesting. Again, we're kind of in the middle, in the 2s, 3s, 4s. But there's a bigger percentage of people on the 4s for how would your volunteers rate you. So that's really encouraging, that people see volunteers as happy with the amounts of power that they're being given. But again, there's always something that you can develop. It's always something that you can talk to your volunteers about how we develop that further. And then what are people doing well on power? People have talked here about inclusion, appreciation, and diversity, the opportunities that are available for volunteers, giving volunteers more kind of autonomy, more engagement with those volunteers. You can see there's a kind of massive overlap with the inclusion thing. Supervision, surveys, feedback. How do we get the volunteers to lead in every kind of different level within the organization? and a kind of exploration of how do we give ownership to volunteers and their managers of as to sort of how the service is run, and how that kind of looks and feels for them on the ground. And then what needs improvement? Some really big ones in the middle here. We've got trust, and that I see as kind of trust between volunteers and volunteer managers, but also between people involved in volunteering and decision makers, trust between those people working in volunteering and the wider community, consistency of power sharing. Again, this kind of varies wildly across different organizations. Some organizations will have more constraints on power as well. I've seen someone in the chat has just said service delivery can't always be 100% built around the volunteers and their wants and needs, and that is completely correct. It needs to be a kind of measured approach that is done on an individual basis for the type of service that you're trying to deliver, or the types of volunteers that you have. And then other things people have mentioned are around things like feedback loops, digital inclusion, more kind of power and recognition. Again, that kind of overlap with the awareness and appreciation theme, how we design roles with volunteers, and opportunities for more kind of truly volunteer-led activity. So what are the things that we want to focus on? Co-production, nothing about us without us. Make sure that you are involving your volunteers where possible, where appropriate, in decision making, in things like service design, and trust that they know their stuff. Again, storytelling. Stories are a really good way of really amplifying those voices, allowing people to speak in their own words, and really kind of giving that responsibility for kind of that messaging to them, putting that power in their hands. And then investment. You can empower your volunteers through lots of different ways, but one of those ways is through training, coaching, mentoring, giving them those skills and confidence and capability that is needed for them to kind of be able to step into those leadership roles, or to develop them for whatever they want to go into going forward. So equity and inclusion. This one is really what it says on the tin. I know that there's loads of people who are thinking about this on a daily basis and doing lots of really fabulous work. Equity and inclusion is about how people are included and feel welcome in a space in kind of all different ways, no matter who they are, what their background is, whether that's their ethnicity or their age or their gender, or where they're from, their socioeconomic background, the different experiences that they have. And we know that there are inequalities within volunteering that we want to try and address. The first thing I'd want to encourage you to do is don't make it more difficult than it has to be. There are a lot of different ways, a lot of kind of really tried and tested methods for making volunteering opportunities accessible where possible, from kind of flexible timings to your shifts, assisted roles, opening up recruitment to be more inclusive, making sure that expenses are really robust, so there isn't a kind of socioeconomic reason why somebody might not be able to volunteer. So I'd really encourage you to kind of pick that low-hanging fruit. There are lots and lots of resources out there for these kind of really kind of little things that you can do that make such a massive difference to the types of people that feel able to come through the door, and that then allow people to kind of stick around and feel welcome and included in that space. This storyteller, chosen to remain anonymous, has said diversity is incredibly important in everything we do. The more we can do, we've got to try our best to have that door open to as many people as possible. But we know there's loads of barriers. Michael here says, I work in the most unequal borough in the country. My experience is that people from the poorest parts, marginalised and racialised people, people who are disabled and so on, often make as good or better volunteers than someone who has the means to make many more choices about what they do with their time, which is something that's really key to keep in mind. We know that there are long-running barriers to people volunteering. There are new barriers to inclusion. The cost of living crisis, for example, is something that is throwing up new barriers for people getting involved in volunteering opportunities. I would really encourage you to just think about what those unique barriers are where you are, because it is going to look different for everybody. There will be some factors that are kind of nationwide, some that might be more specific to where you are, or kind of different volunteering opportunities that you're involved in. And have a think about how, what the kind of best approach is to really breaking down those specific barriers that you're facing. And equality and diversity is something where it's really key that we learn from each other. So this is, as I said at the beginning, this is something lots of people are doing. This is a really kind of hot topic at the moment, which is a good thing, because that means there's lots of people trying things, there's lots of people sharing resources, there's loads of learning out there. And we need to make sure that that learning is being shared as broadly as possible. So if you've done something that worked really well or didn't work, maybe, how can you share that? How can you really bring other people along on that journey with you and make sure that people aren't going to make the same mistakes that you do, or can do it the right way first time? And how can you learn from those around you who are doing EDI well? Seek out those people who you think are really nailing this and go talk to them about what they're doing and how and why, and take that learning back with you to your organization. We're only going to get this right if we all talk to each other and learn from each other. And then flexibility. We've got a really interesting quote here from Charlotte, who's a volunteer as well as a volunteer manager. I know we need to make volunteering more open, we need to make it more flexible, and we need to make it more community-led, easier to access. But then when I sit here as a volunteer manager or someone in that kind of role, I'm thinking about risk, I'm thinking about compliance, I'm thinking about safeguarding. And we know that there can be, there's lots of different things that volunteer managers, people who design volunteering opportunities have to think about. It's a balancing act between things like our legal duties, safeguarding duties, practical duties, flexibility in how we approach volunteering can sometimes feel like a kind of nice add-on once we've got that service delivered and all of our policies in place. But we should be thinking about it the other way around. We should be thinking about something like flexibility and inclusion as something that is as integral to our operations as everything else. And sometimes that means that we need to build that flexibility kind of in by design, start from the ground up. How do we start thinking about that flexibility right from the very beginning? So back to our bar charts. ED&I is something that people also think that volunteers think more highly than the organizations themselves, which is interesting. Again, think about how you think you would rate your organization, how your volunteers would rate you. Go and talk to people about why they think that they have that impression of what you do. What's going well? I think in general, the volunteering sector, the volunteering community is a place that is welcoming. There is a lot of co-production going on. There's a lot of communication. Communication is on their side. So we've got communication and communicating, and a place where people really kind of listen. There's a lot of warmth within the volunteering sector. Good leadership can have a really good impact on equality and diversity. Recognizing those strengths, taking a proactive approach, an intersectional approach, making sure that you actually are monitoring your kind of performance within equity and inclusion. And I really like the one at the top here, which is an eagerness to learn. It is a learning process, and it's okay if we don't get it right first time, kind of continually improving and getting closer to that place that we want to be. And as a reminder, the Vision for Volunteering is a 10-year program. This is something that doesn't have to happen overnight. We need to kind of just take those steps towards where we want to be in the long term. But what needs improvement? The big one here is around accessibility, and sometimes there will be specific volunteering opportunities that aren't accessible or cannot be made accessible for one reason or another. But you should always be asking yourself, how can we make these things accessible to the greatest possible extent, whilst also considering practicalities. That flexibility, we know that there is a lot of exciting stuff happening within the volunteering spaces around kind of micro volunteering and short-term volunteering and home-based volunteering. But there is also a lot of very traditional models of volunteering that are still around, that might not be serving us anymore. People say we need to build that accessibility in, we need to be more transparent. Diversity of trustees can be an issue. Data collection can be an issue, and we need to make sure that we're working on things like language, and reflecting on the work that we do with volunteers. This isn't something that is just going to change naturally. It has to be something that's intentional. And then looking ahead, I've just said it, equity and inclusion have to be intentional. So this requires really truly listening to and collaborating with your volunteers, with your beneficiaries and wider communities, to shape those environments into something that means that people are eager to engage with them, rather than making any kind of assumptions about what people need or want, or to how to make something more accessible or more inclusive. I mentioned it before, but expenses really is a quick win to make your volunteering opportunities more accessible. I know that when I was a volunteer manager, I really struggled to get my volunteers to claim expenses. But the more that you can encourage that, there to be a kind of good culture of volunteers claiming expenses, the more kind of normalized and accessible that can make it. And then just coming back to this idea of flexibility. So building volunteer opportunities around the volunteer and their needs, rather than the other way around, which is kind of expecting volunteers to slot into volunteering opportunities that have been sort of created based around need. And once again, this is a balancing act. It does need to be two-way between you and the volunteer. The organization needs to get something out of it, the volunteer needs to get something out of it, but how do you meet in the middle? And how do you both stay kind of flexible? How do you both compromise and reach that best possible solution? So collaboration, you'll already see, again, tons of overlap of what we've already been talking about. Collaboration is, again, in its kind of widest sense, about collaboration between volunteers and volunteer managers and decision makers and broader communities, between different organizations. Anything that you can think of, let's collaborate on it. So coming back to this idea of funding, funding is a really good opportunity for collaboration, but it can also be a hindrance. So competitive funding processes can really contribute to this culture of a lack of trust between organizations, kind of making them compete. But we're also kind of in a world now where funders are looking more favorably on joint bids for funding. There's a great quote that I really like from Georgie Grant at the Onion Collective, which says, organizations often don't realize how much common ground and shared goals they have. Get them talking and great things happen. So when you are thinking about funding, and when we're going back to that kind of idea of sustainability, how can you work with others in terms of your funding to kind of make that as easy as possible for everybody, and to make sure that we have a kind of greater service at the end of it. Collaboration is something that's always worth it. Investing in your networks and investing in your kind of partnerships, but it can feel, again, like a kind of nice to have, especially when you're focusing so much on your actual, day-to-day service delivery. You don't have a lot of time or capacity. So I would really challenge you to just ask, how do you make time and the space for networking and building those relationships, in amongst all of the kind of busy noise of the day-to-day. And again, I really like this quote from Molly. It's really amazing. It's a really amazing thing to get together with other people and do things and make a difference. Don't underestimate that. That's such a powerful thing. Collaboration really can kind of open doors that you can't do on your own. Something that we're really interested in is this idea of sharing volunteers, or having volunteers who work with lots of different organizations. And it's a really easy way to kind of share those skills, share those connections, avoid duplication, make connections. Michael says the best things that we build between people. The approach he's taken as a volunteer manager is, I've tried to be a person who connects people and thinks about interesting ways to combine people's strengths and goals together to try and take collective projects forward. can see in the chat people are sharing kind of interesting collaborative projects that they are working on, and that's really fabulous. But yeah, just the challenge: who can you collaborate with to make this happen? Because it can completely unlock doors, and can also help with things like volunteer recruitment if you're kind of sharing that burden. Collaboration is something that needs to go all the way to the top. We know that a kind of key challenge around this can be getting senior buy-in for this, and this kind of comes back to that idea of capacity. If senior leaders don't see collaboration as something that's important, then how are you going to make time with it, make time for it? We've got a quote from Rowan here who says that we can collaborate in loads of different ways, from something as as really small as like a broken chair to, oh, that program's really inclusive. They've got clients looking for different volunteers and we can signpost to them. Collaboration works best when it happens at kind of every level of the organization. So how can you kind of sell those benefits of collaboration and partnership working to senior leaders? How do we get more senior leaders collaborating with other senior leaders to kind of make sure that they are prioritizing the value and the worth of volunteering? And here are our numbers. Collaboration is one where people think that maybe volunteers are less enthusiastic about it than organizations are, which says to me that maybe we're better at collaborating as organizations than we are at collaborating with our volunteers, which is a kind of another method to look at. What are people doing well? I love that the word local is really big here. Making local connections is a really fab way of really kind of building that collaborative network. So we've also got things in here like making sure that collaborative opportunities are suitable and relevant, sharing practice with each other, which I mentioned before, sharing things like your workload, making sure that we're just asking. The worst someone can say is no. Advocating for our volunteers, working with partners, working strategically, having a kind of wider understanding of volunteers amongst staff, making sure that that's something that's built into the organization at every level. And what needs improvement? People talking about sharing volunteers, about onboarding, how we kind of build collaborative work into that process. Making sure that we're actioning volunteer feedback. Again, we talked about kind of standard ways of working, partnerships, more volunteer involvement in that, sharing examples and sort of promoting the good work that we are doing. So looking ahead, key things to think about: senior buy-in, make sure that those senior leaders and trustees recognize that value of collaboration as a contributor to business as usual, not an extra thing that we can tack on if we've got time, which we won't. Reframe your thinking. Make sure that you're not seeing other local organizations around you as competitors. Everybody that you meet who is working within this space should be a potential mutual collaborator. And skill sharing, which can be kind of, it's almost like a slight the kind of twin to volunteer sharing. So swapping skills or doing kind of mutual aid with other local charities can really help you get things that you wouldn't otherwise without necessarily being able to pay for them. So, oh, those people over there are really good at this particular process, or they know a lot about working with this particular community. How can we learn from them? What can we give back? And then that will open up loads and loads of doors and build those kind of local connections while you're there. So then the last theme is experimentation. And this is really about kind of innovating. The vision for volunteering as an idea kind of started off the back of the pandemic, and people doing things very differently in response to obviously a kind of big national crisis. What we want is for experimentation and innovation to be something that is really natural, really kind of spontaneous, that's built into our everyday working rather than that only happens when something goes wrong. But there is a big barrier here, which is resistance to change. This voluntary organisation in Leicestershire talked about how they were looking into a volunteer management system, but some team members became a bit fearful that that could erase their jobs, and that it needs to take kind of baby steps to progress. Change can be scary, and that's really kind of natural. But there are ways that we can kind of approach change to make them more stable and steady and less scary. So how do we experiment in a way that feels collaborative, feels empowering, feels inclusive, is kind of the culmination of all of those different themes that we have been looking at across this session as well. And building on from that idea of kind of baby steps, small change is still change. Experimentation doesn't have to be about something big or something dramatic. Find the little things, something that maybe just needs a teeny little tweak to be done a little bit different, and start with that. So Millie says, just go ahead and do it. Even the tiniest little thing makes a massive difference. And sometimes it's the small things that matter the most. No matter what you do, it's going to make a difference. Anything you do to make a change will affect somebody in some way. So start with thinking about what's that one thing that's always bothered you that you wish that you could do differently. And then you can start from there. And the more that we build a kind of culture of experimentation and innovation, the more comfortable that process is going to get for us, for volunteer managers, for volunteers as well. Once again, I'm banging on about listening. So listen to, learn from others. I said that back in the equity and inclusion one. The only way that we're going to kind of learn is by sharing what we do. Volunteers can be a really kind of great source of new ideas and approaches. So David and Chris from Emmaus say, yeah, we can only do that by we listen to other people, by speaking to each other, by listening to what they have to say. It all starts with that communication, that speaking and listening. So think about who you can learn from locally, but also think about how you can share what you do with other people, which leads me very nicely into failure is your friend. If you've done something and it didn't work, that is just as much of a kind of learning part of the learning process as if you tried something new and it did work. But there can be a real kind of barrier around that fear of failure and that kind of fear of the unknown. So how do we redefine our relationship with those unknowns in uncertain circumstances, to start thinking of failure as a friend, rather than something that we need to avoid at all costs. And this does come back to that conversation about funding, and how do we, if a funded program doesn't do what we're expecting it to do, how can we have those conversations with funders to kind of show that that is still a really valuable experience and still something that is worth investing in. And I like this quote from Molly from Groundwork: pay attention to the things that are a bit awkward and a bit sticky, and say to people running organizations, why are they like that? Often we are kind of stuck with processes that have been run a certain way because they've always been done that certain way, and sometimes that's fine and sometimes it's not, and we should move on from the things that are no longer serving us. How would you rate your organization for experimentation, and how would your volunteers rate you? Again, here organizations are a little bit more favorable than they think that the volunteers would be. Maybe we need to talk more to our volunteers about how we're experimenting, or bring them along on that journey, make sure that they're having a positive experience of that experimentation as well. What are we doing well? Collaborating, love the overlap with the teams, making sure that we're listening to volunteers, making sure that we've got flexibility, making sure we've got inclusion. People have talked about that lived experience again, involving leadership, inclusivity, utilizing those volunteer skills, using those the kind of information and knowledge from those communities, making sure that we're being open to the idea of change, and those new ideas, and using those skills that we have within the community. And then what needs improvement? We've talked about that appetite for risk, being brave. This is another place where sort of time and resources can be a challenge. It can be difficult to try something new if we're really kind of up against it just delivering the day job, which means that we need that flexibility. We might need resources to be able to do it. We need to kind of reduce those barriers, that red tape, getting kind of stuck in our ways. And we need to trust each other, because this stuff is only going to happen and it's only going to work if we're working in those kind of truly kind of collaborative environments. So looking ahead, there's been a little bit of chatter in the chat about micro volunteering. Could you try it? It's kind of increasingly popular experimental method of attracting and involving more volunteers. And it might be that it doesn't work for you, and that's fine, but at least you've tried it. Sharing your learning, making sure that you are talking about what you're doing, whether it works or whether it doesn't, and taking those baby steps. All change is incremental, but small changes can make a really big difference to people. Okay, so I'm going to just run over a couple of examples. I am aware of time, and I would love to have a little bit of time at the end for a couple of questions if we have time. So I'll run through these quite quickly. Just a couple of examples of what people are doing for the vision in practice. I've got a number of strategic examples, and then we'll go on to a couple of practical ones. So strategic stuff is all about how do we build the vision for volunteering into what we're doing locally? How do we make sure that we're coming back to these themes regularly, challenging ourselves and thinking about them? So one example is Birmingham, who created their own vision for volunteering 2027, which they worked closely with citizens, the voluntary community, faith community, social enterprises, public sector, and others to really look about sort of what was needed in Birmingham and how they were going to deliver that locally. They've got 3 principles: celebrating difference, collaboration, and awareness and appreciation. And we do also have on our website, there's a link there to other kind of local areas that have done a really similar thing. So you can go on and have a look and read about how they've done those and maybe think about whether that's something that might be worth doing for you locally. Cheshire West and Chester are running a series of vision for volunteering workshops at the moment, designed to create a new kind of 5-year strategy, 5-year sort of voluntary strategy for Cheshire West and Chester, which will have the vision for volunteering kind of at its heart, but making sure that that is sort of how that is kind of practically is being discussed with stakeholders and citizens and other people within the voluntary and community sector. If that is something that you might be interested in doing, we do have a free toolkit on our website, which you can download, which gives you a kind of session plan and slides for introducing people to the vision for volunteering and starting to have a think about what that might mean for you locally. And Volunteering Matters held a series of sessions looking at place-based volunteering. So that with young people involved in youth social action, people with additional needs, people who are refugees and asylum seekers, really discussing about how they relate to the vision for volunteering and how that kind of practically is going to look with that kind of implementation. And they had a series of key reflections, things like making sure we're connecting people to decision making, supporting this long-term funding, and you can read more about that on our website as well. And then just a whistle stop of a couple of different examples of what people are doing, particularly to bring the vision to life. And because I love colour coding, they're all done by themes. So for awareness and appreciation, we've got Kent Wildlife Trust, which ran a project called Down to Earth, which was with women in Romney Marsh to become involved in volunteering and the community. And these women were really encouraged to kind of take ownership and responsibility of those activities, creating activities and roles that suited their individual circumstances. And they ended up with loads and loads of women involved in that project, some for the first time, some sort of bringing their families who might not have otherwise become involved in any kind of volunteering opportunities locally. For power, I will take every opportunity I can to shout about the I Will movement, which is run by one of our partners, Volunteering Matters, which empowers kind of youth social activists aged 10 to 25 from all backgrounds to kind of make a positive difference on the issues that affect their lives. So really kind of just amplifying their voices and letting them run with the kind of ideas and campaigning and issues that are really close to their hearts. For equity and inclusion, Communities First ran a speed matching trustee recruitment event, which was designed to try and diversify the people who might typically be underrepresented on trustee boards. And so they specifically invited people who might be underrepresented, but then they also worked with those people to kind of really demystify that trusteeship process and challenge some of those preconceptions. to get new people involved. For collaboration, we have some kind of place-based social action from place called Watch It. That's how you pronounce it. So they won some funding to bring residents together to kind of talk about and identify those issues that they felt that needed addressing together. And just this act of kind of bringing these people together led to these new links being forged by groups which hadn't previously worked together or hadn't even heard of each other. A community transport scheme was launched, a printed community newspaper was created, and they ended up refurbishing a local bookshop, which now hosts training courses and a youth group. So a little bit of collaboration at the beginning can really kind of often spiral into lots of new, really interesting projects. And in experimentation, Staffordshire Wildlife Trust did a micro-volunteering event with Voluntary Action Stoke-on-Trent, where they invited asylum seekers and refugees who maybe had never volunteered before or didn't really understand what volunteering meant or whether they would be able to do it, to this micro-volunteering event where they were making bird feeders and spending time in nature, which really allowed them to, develop their own confidence and realize what they were able to offer, and help them kind of get involved in some of those volunteering opportunities going forward. Okay, that is the end of my presentation. Please do keep in touch. If you're not already, the best way of kind of keeping in touch with us is to sign up to the newsletter. You will get all of the information there first. But we are also on social media, on Twitter and on LinkedIn. And please do check out our website, visionforvolunteering.org.uk. We've got loads of resources on there, which are all kind of free to download. We also often run events like these, which are always kind of free and open access to come and learn more. If you want to get in touch with the team, you can just drop us an email on hello@visionforvolunteering.org.uk, and we'll try and get back to you and help where we can. Thank you.